Microsoft project functionality and also some Quick PMO. So as Victoria mentioned, Quick PMO is our add-on product to Microsoft Project Online or Project Server. So talk about some best practices for managing project scope, specifically within within schedule management. And then you'll also see some of our tool sets within Quick PMO that can help you manage project scope at the individual project level. And of course, as mentioned already, a Q&A section at the end. So scope creep, whether you refer to it as that, requirement creep, functional creep, kitchen sink syndrome, whatever you may refer to it as, of course, it refers to changes or perhaps uncontrolled growth in a project scope at any point after the project begins. So it can occur if the scope of the project is not properly defined or documented or controlled. It can be seen as a risk, but scope creep isn't always bad. It can sometimes derail a project, but it can also represent an opportunity for your organization to improve your processes and procedures, improve relationships with your customers. And scope creep should almost be expected with most projects. So it's how you manage it that counts. Sometimes it can be avoided, but oftentimes we just have to manage scope creep by following a number of best practices. So some of those best practices are non-technical in nature. So things along the lines of involving your end users or involving your customers early on in the project. Standardizing and incorporating a change control board or a portfolio review board for the periodic evaluation of your project's performance and overall portfolio performance. Understanding what any project's key deliverables are and how they should map to your portfolio's business drivers. And then doing other things like avoiding gold plating in the product's features. Gold plating, if you're not familiar with that term, it's a term in software engineering where you have users that are working on project tasks to the point where the extra effort is not worth the added value. For an example, after you've already met certain requirements in say a software development product, the developers might continue working on further enhancements, thinking the customer is going to be delighted with these enhancements. So rather than just delivering what was asked for or expected, they continue to over polish the product, and that can certainly lead to scope creep as well. Other things you can do to manage the overall scope of your project is just following some best practices for effective schedule management. So with that, let me go ahead and navigate over to my demo environment, which is utilizing a specific tool, so Microsoft Project Online. So what you are looking at here is the landing page of what we refer to as PWA, or Project Web App. So that is the web interface to Microsoft's Project Online environment. Microsoft's Project Online environment, that's their standard PPM platform. You can also have the application installed in your own data center or on premises. We refer to that as Project Server. But in either case, the functionality is the same. So whether you're talking Project Online and utilizing software as a service, or you have this application in your own environment and you refer to it as Project Server. So I'm going to take you through some practices that you can follow in this specific tool to help you manage the scope of your project. And in particular, so what I'll do first is I'll kind of put on a PM hat, and act as if I'm managing a particular project, and I need to keep the schedule in alignment with what has already been determined to be what we're going to be building and delivering. So I'm going to navigate into this area called the Project Center, which is where I'll be able to see the portfolio of projects. And I'm going to open up one of the projects I own, specifically in the Microsoft Project application. So if you use Microsoft Project at all, the client application, regardless of whether you use it in a Project Online environment or Project Server environment, Microsoft Project Client is what you would typically use to manage the schedule of any given project. So I'm going to navigate down to this software development area here, and I'm going to open up, I have a project called this B0001 SAP integration project. I'm going to select that. And once it opens up, I'm going to then navigate to the schedule of this project. Now with Project Online and Project Server, I can utilize the web interface to manage the schedule. But of course, if I want some more deep functionality in schedule management, I'm going to want to use the Microsoft Project Professional client, which integrates with this. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to edit this in Microsoft Project. And then, overall, talking about all the different tools and capabilities that we can have to, manage overall scope of the project, I might be putting the cart before the horse here slightly, but imagine if you would, in this first scenario here, what I'm going to do is, imagine that you've had an approved scope change come along with your project. It's not reflected in the project schedule yet, but you need to incorporate that into your project schedule, and then measure, continuously the progress of your project against the new details that are going to be incorporated into that schedule. Okay, so that's sort of the hypothetical scenario that I'm displaying here. So we have, I've got a work breakdown structure already defined. I even have progress on some of the tasks in my schedule. Some of them are complete. Okay. And again, imagine if you would, scenario here is there has been an approved scope change. We're going to deliver something that was not originally part of the schedule, but we're now going to incorporate it into the schedule. And, we don't want to just reset everything and measure against just those new deliverables and new requirements, but, we want to measure against the original and then also the, the newly included scope changes or new deliverables that we're trying to achieve here. So let me try to keep this, real simple and straightforward. But let me go down to this development section here. And I am going to, in this add-on functionality summary task, I'm going to add a new task that's going to, prolong the, certainly going to increase the critical path of this project and, probably prolong the finish date on this. So I'm going to put, again, this I'll circle back and I'll talk about, okay, what are all of the inputs? How should we have communicated and, handled, the decisions that were made that fed into this scope change? I'll circle to that secondarily, but in this scenario, we've already had an approved scope change. So I'm just going to, make up a new task to refer to this. Just kind of give it a hypothetical name here, put a duration on that. We're going to assign it to, we don't know which specific developer yet, so I'm going to use a generic developer role in this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to link it up with the tasks that are already in this section here. So, sort of get it in line with, it's going to follow up this SF test, it's going to follow up this Suite Edition, excuse me, is the new task I added. So what I have over here, I'm showing a column called Finish Variance. And the topic specifically that I want to address here is when you want to track your project, against what the original plan was, you have to have baselines of your project schedule. So in Microsoft Project, you're actually able to create multiple baselines. And the way you do so, if you're familiar with Microsoft Project, I'm sure you've done this before, but if you haven't, on the Project tab in the ribbon, there is a set baseline operation. And I'm just going to stay on the screen and describe things a little bit. So when you take a baseline of your overall project, essentially what it does is it captures about 20 different metrics, mostly date and cost related. So what was the start date and finish date of each task in here, overall project start finish, what were the, the original work values, what were the original cost values, things like that, and it snapshots them. So if you have slippage over time, or if you have cost overruns, or you have anything that changes with respect to the original plan, you're able to track what those changes are. Now, in the case of something like this, where my schedule was pretty much set, okay, you can see here in my baseline dropdown, I do already have a couple baselines taken of this. So your very first baseline, something that's often referred to in here as baseline 0, it's something that should be taken, when your schedule is pretty well fleshed out, but before you've actually started the project. Okay. Now, a lot of times you might do like phased planning, or you might do kind of like rolling estimates in here. You might not have a point in time where the full entire schedule is fully fleshed out before you begin work. Okay, and I'm going to talk about how you can handle a situation like that. Okay, or you might have a situation like this where it was pretty fleshed out before we started working, but now we have this new requirement that's come along that's going to push out. When I added this new task and the 25-day duration on it, you can see here the highlighting of everything else that was impacted by that. So my overall development summary is being impacted by this new addition. And if I, scroll down through, okay, I get to the very end of the project itself, I can see that that's also being impacted by this new task that I've added here. So it's pretty obvious that this task is on the critical path. So what I want to do is I want to incorporate this into my baseline, but what I don't want to do is I don't want to just override my initial baseline. If I do so, then my variance on here, everything is going to just reset to 0, and I will only be tracking against, the latest inclusion of this new task. Okay, so typical best practice for baseline in a scenario like this, and there's actually two scenarios at play here. One where you're doing, phased planning and you don't have everything in the schedule before you start progress on it, or two, when you have scope changes that have been interjected in the schedule and you want to include them in the original, okay, but then also have a rebaseline of everything. So let me close this window here and kind of take a step back and walk you through this. So what I want to do here is I'm going to select just this task. I'm going to go to my set baseline. Okay, and typical procedure here is with each new phase or with each scope change, what we generally recommend is you baseline the entire project to a new baseline value. Now, of course, you only get 11 overall. So if there have been, more than, say, 10 scope changes plus the original project, you're eventually going to have to override some of those earlier ones. Okay, but generally speaking, 11 should cover pretty much any scenario out there. So in this case, I already have baseline 0 saved. I have baseline 1 saved. I'm going to rebaseline my whole entire project, but I'm going to set it in baseline value 2. I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay. Now, it doesn't change the finish variance on all of this stuff here. Okay, but what I'm then going to do is I'm going to select this singular task, and I'm going to set a baseline on just the selected tasks, and I'm going to actually roll this one up into the original baseline. But what I'm not doing is I'm not re-snapshotting the whole entire project here. I'm just re-snapshotting. If it was, this whole section that's been modified, I could highlight the whole section, or in this case, just, the individual task that I added. So it depends on how much new data you've added to your project schedule. Okay, so I'm going to say, hey, just baseline the selected tasks and roll up anything here to any summary tasks as well. So any change that this makes to the add-on functionality and or, the development cycle up here, we're going to roll those changes up. Okay. Now, it's going to give me a warning here that this baseline has already been used. I'm not too worried about that warning since I'm not rebaselining the entire project. I'm just baselining certain tasks. Okay, so now that I've done that, you can see down below, it doesn't set the slate or wipe the slate clean on everything. So I still have variance that's being tracked on the other tasks here that were not included in that newest baseline, but everything that's impacted by the new. So now in this whole development section, I'm going to track according to this new deliverable that I have here, this suite edition. Okay, so over time, if things do change, let's say that, we're getting a little bit closer to the time that we're going to start working on here, but we've determined 25 days isn't going to be enough. I increase that duration, or I increase work, or I increase resources. Any of them will have an impact on my my variance figures. But if I make a change like that, now you can see here, now, okay, I've got 5 days of a finish variance against that latest inclusion, this FX Suite edition, and then it's also throwing my overall development cycle, 5 days off as well. Okay, so going back, quick review here. If I go back to the project, set baseline. Okay, so a good process to follow out there when you have scope changes or when you have new phases that you want to incorporate in the baseline is baseline the entire project to a new baseline slot, new baseline value, but then baseline just the selected areas that are impacted. Okay, and roll the details up to summary tasks and incorporate them into the original baseline. That way, when you're looking at things like finish variance, cost variance, basically anything that has a variance in the name. So if I want to look at cost variance, okay, project is always going to track that against the original baseline. Okay, now if I wanted to view, well, okay, what did baseline 1 or baseline 2 have? Okay, so for things like finish, I can see over here, I have the current finish date in here. And if I wanted to take a look at the baseline finish of any of these tasks in here, there is a baseline finish. Now that's going to be against my original baseline 0 slot, my first one. Or I can add baseline 1 in here. Okay, track against that finish too, so I can see, what slipped between baseline 0 and baseline 1. Okay, now that can be a little bit tough, tough to manage with, this data and columns here. So there's also a graphical way to analyze this as well. Okay, so again, if you've had, perhaps multiple scope changes and some of which have been incorporated into your baseline, and you want to compare multiple baselines on a project, what you have, if I go over to the View menu here, okay, what I'm looking at here, actually let me get my tasks in the Gantt so I can see them. So I'm going to scroll. Not only am I going to scroll to the task, but I'm going to change my time scale a little bit, zoom out so I can see, see more of the project in my time scale here. Quarters is a little long. I'll go to months. Okay, so I can see, I can see the overall Gantt visually of my project, and actually even months is zoomed out a little bit far. So we'll switch to weeks there. A little bit easier to take. So on a simple Gantt, I'm not really showing, any tracking information. I'm just showing what the current plan of these tasks looks like. Now, there are a couple options here. I can also select a tracking Gantt, which will show me how I'm tracking against the baseline. Now, it is, again, just going to show against baseline 0. So for any of these, what I'm able to do is I'm able to see, okay, how it's tracked against the original baseline value. So currently, okay, what we're seeing here is you'll see a gray bar that represents, reflects the current reality. Okay, and you'll see a blue bar if it's a standard task not on the critical path. Okay, and a red bar if it is a task on the critical path. Okay, so and the red and blue reflects the baseline values. Gray reflects where you currently are with that task. So here I can see, a gray bar that slipped well out from where the baseline of that task originally was. Okay. And again, if I change my time scale and zoom out a little bit more, let's say to weeks, be a little bit easier to measure. So here I can see how far these have drifted off merely by the inclusion of some new 25 days of new deliverables in my schedule. Another option when you have, now this is great for tracking against the original baseline. Okay, so again here, gray baseline value, red, this is a task on the current path, and this is where it currently is fitting in the schedule, so I can see how far it's from that original baseline time slot. If you have multiple baselines, we have a view for that as well. So on my Gantt drop down here on the View tab, I'm going to, now if you don't see it in the built-in here, you can always select more views and basically select any of the built-in views or user-defined views that have been created. The one I'm specifically looking for is called Multiple Baseline Gantt. Okay, and what it has, okay, is it has different colored bars, okay, for each baseline that you've taken. Okay, now, there's a setting in here where you can specify what color to use for each one. The default, it's going to use blue for the first one, red for the second, green for the second, and, there's a whole series of colors that it's going to go through. So again, adjusting my time scale here a little bit, I can see how the multiple baselines, so originally this testing section in here, which is 128 days starting June 2nd, ending November 29th, okay, I can see what it looked like originally with the blue baseline, okay, what it looks like after the second baseline with red, and what it looks like currently with green out here. So the overall duration of this has changed a couple times from my initial plan. So again, I can see, I can track in one column what my variance is against the baseline 0, but in this multiple Gantt, I can also visually see how it's changed over time. Okay. So when you're doing any kind of status reporting on your project, reporting slippage, reporting overall progress on this, you've got A, the ability to track against your original baseline, but then B, the ability to track against multiple baselines should you have things like scope changes that have that have been approved that you now need to incorporate into your schedule. So on that, I'm going to switch gears a little bit. So again, I said when I jumped right into here, I might be putting the cart before the horse a little bit, kind of jumping to a scenario where we've already had an approved scope change, and now we're incorporating that into the schedule. Let me take a step back, and let's talk about some of the tools that we have to help manage manage scope, help with communication overall within the project, help the team, not only the PM and the portfolio manager and the stakeholders of the project, but also the project team, the people that are working on the individual tasks in a project, how we can help them collaborate and how we can keep communication sort of centralized and keep us rolling along with regards to scope. So I'm going to minimize this. And I'm just going to navigate back to the project center. I'm going to close this project that I had open out, and I'm going to select a different project that's a little bit further along. This project's kind of already in progress, has a little bit more data in it. So let me expand out this software development section again. Okay, so these are all the software development type projects where I am specified as the owner. So again, I'm still kind of wearing my project manager hat here. And I'm going to go into one called AGH Software Dev. So when you access a project from the project center, typically that's where PM, a program manager, a portfolio owner, somebody like that will go to take a look at any of the details of the project, like the schedule, okay, like any kind of budget and cost information, things along those lines. So here I've got what's referred to as a project details page that tracks my, my original estimates for cost on the project, my approved budget costs for the project, and then some of my currently calculated costs that are emanating from the schedule of this. So, as work is actually completed, I'm having some of the, labor, non-labor costs being calculated and presenting on this page here. Okay, but where the team of the project, will spend a fair amount of time and collaborate, and where things like the RAID log, so risks, action items, issues, decisions, any of the artifacts related to the project, like, okay, where's our charter kept? Those types of things. Those are stored on the project site. So again, within this tool, within the Project Online platform or Microsoft Project Server, it's typical that when you load a project into the tool, a project site is created for each project. So that's, again, where you can store any kind of documents and those RAID logs that I referred to, where those are kept. So I'm going to navigate to the project site for this specific project, which is called AGH Software Dev. And I'll show you some, tips, tricks, and best practices that you can follow with managing, managing the various project assets, project artifacts that that can address change requests, that can address things that might have an impact on scope. Okay, and again, not solely talking about avoiding scope creep here. Again, the scope might change of a project, but how do we manage it? How do we address that? Okay, so. Again, I want to kind of describe what's in front of you here. So this is not a vanilla out-of-the-box project site. This is a Quick PMO project site. So with the Quick PMO toolset, essentially, in a nutshell, what it is, it's a configurable but already pre-configured solution that bolts on top of Project Online that makes the platform more turnkey. So rather than spending weeks, perhaps months, of configuring workflows, fields, web pages, forms, things like that to get the platform to the point where your PMs, program managers, stakeholders, et cetera, are able to use it, Quick PMO gives you reports, templates, features, out of the box to get you up and running faster. So this particular project site, to kind of draw a contrast, if we were looking at a vanilla Project Online site, essentially all we would have on those vanilla Project Online sites would be you'd have a risks list, an issues list. You would have this little visual timeline of the project schedule, and you would also have a document library for you to store documents, things like project charter, customer acceptance letter, things like that. Beyond that, anything that you're seeing, excuse me, on the screen, beyond what I just pointed out right there, it's something that's unique to our Quick PMO tool set. Okay, so again, topic of this webinar is managing scope within your project. So we're not going to go through absolutely everything that's on this site, but let me walk you through some of the things, sort of procedurally that can help the stakeholders, can help the project team, and again can help the project manager to keep things aligned with the scope of the project. So I made the reference to RAID earlier. If you're not familiar with that acronym, it's risks, action items, issues, and decisions. And we have a list on our project site for each one of those. So the workflow of certain things that may have an overall impact on scope, somebody might raise a risk, so log something in that list first, might get escalated to being an issue. Okay. Some issues are you know, avoided, some are mitigated. So you know, there's different outcomes and dispositions of issues, but might be an issue that could also lead to a change request. Okay, so okay, here's something that, you know, hey, we're going to have to deliver this. It wasn't part of the original scope, but you know, we're definitely going to have to include this. And then logging that and keeping track of that. So you know, again, ultimately, from a tactical standpoint, those impacts are going to have to get loaded into the schedule. So you already saw that, you know, kind of in a nutshell. But from a you know, from an asset tracking standpoint, you know, those change requests might also emanate into decisions being made. And from there, you know, adding new sections to the schedule, rebaselining, things like that. Any of the artifacts that you put in any of these 4 lists, they can then be tied to certain sections of the schedule themselves. So it's something that not a lot of people know. Sort of like that best practice with the baseline earlier. It's you know, not a procedure that you know, a lot of organizations follow, but you know, certainly considered to be a best practice. So you know, let me walk you through the forms of some of these. So I'll navigate into my risks list first. I have several risks that have already been logged in here. You know, the topic of this is not risk management, so we're not going to get into the nuts and bolts of, you know, what should go into your risks list. But you know, I mean, anything that raises a unique concern, you know, that raises something that might impact scheduling, you know, cost, budget, resources, availability, things like that, that's unique, you know, could be articulated as a risk on this. So I'm going to click the new item form here. You'll see the details that are included in our risk log here. So I can put a title on this. Okay. You know, so for instance, got a dev outsourcing, and the rates might increase on that. We've sort of caught wind of that in some recent discussion with a vendor recently. Okay, so we've got an owner field and an assigned to. So you know, who ultimately answers for this risk, but who's going to work on it? Okay, so while it's being you know, addressed and either building out a contingency plan, a mitigation plan, an avoidance plan, something like that, I'm going to put myself in the assigned to here. Okay, the neat thing about this assigned to field is this bubbles up to the PWA landing page at the very top, that first page that I showed you here. So if there are risks or issues or action items assigned to me, okay, I can view those on that landing page. There's a little tile there called My Risks, My Issues, My Action Items, okay? And that way, if I happen to be on 10 different projects, let's say, I don't have to constantly bounce from project site to project site to project site to keep track of them. This will aggregate to the top level for me. So I've got a status option here, you know, active, postponed, closed. I can categorize these. The categories here are configurable. Okay, so I have some pretty generic ones in here. Is this risk going to impact, you know, scope or schedule or customer deliverable or a vendor? So, you know, kind of unique to this type of project. Okay, and let's say it is a vendor type category risk here. I can put a due date on that. Okay. Also, for calculating overall risk exposure, I can put in a probability that this might occur. Okay, and an impact, which is on a 1 to 10 scale, which again is configurable, but out of the box it's a 1 to 10 scale. What's the magnitude should this risk actually happen? That's going to calculate an overall risk exposure value. If I know a cost, I can enter that. Okay, and then of course, as this thing gets actioned, so I'm just going to leave it at that for now. I don't know what the mitigation plan or contingency plan or trigger description is. I'm going to let Aaron work on that after I have it assigned to him. So you know, I can log this in here. Okay. Now you can have workflows, you can have alerts. So when this happens, you know, again, you don't necessarily want to fire an email off every time somebody has a risk or an action item or an issue assigned to them, because again, if I'm going to open on a separate tab here, I'm going to open that landing page up for Project Online and just kind of point out what I referred to a little bit ago. There is, on the landing page, there is a My Risks and My Issues page, which will show you any risks, issues. We have a separate one for action items that have been assigned to a user. So, you know, passive tracking of them can be done here by visiting the landing page and then navigating, you know, specifically if it's a risk or an issue, navigating to this page to access them. If you want more proactive notification, then again, you can configure alerts or use a workflow on this list to do that. Okay. So there's an example of, you know, of logging a risk, assigning it to somebody. I'll quickly go through some of the other ones here as well. Won't spend a whole lot of time on each one. Now, by the way, I don't have to navigate into the list and then hit the new button. I can also click this little plus symbol to log a new risk or an issue or an action item, or basically any of these logs right from the landing page. So it brings up the form in a little dialog here. So this happens to be an issue. I can log a new issue in this way. Okay, a lot of the same metadata or fields, if you will, exist for issues that exist for risks. And if you consider it this way, a lot of times what an issue is a risk that's that's come to fruition. It's been realized. Okay. Now natively, there isn't a capability to move a risk over to the issues list, but programmatically, we can use workflows, or we can add that functionality in here as well. Okay. Sometimes the risks could creep in that don't already have issues. Could creep up that did not already have a risk logged for it. So, in this case, I just might log a new item in here. Okay. Now, for managing, really managing the scope of the project, risks and issues, you may or may not. I mean, A, they might not come to fruition. B, they might not have an impact overall on the scope of the project. It might just be an issue that's going to, temporarily delay deliverable of something, might not be on the critical path. Okay, but nonetheless, it's going to give visibility to the stakeholders and to the project team that those things exist. Okay, for things that more likely will have an impact on the overall either the budget, schedule, or scope in some way, shape, or form, we have a change request and then ultimately a decisions list that we can use for tracking that stuff as well. So I'm going to click on the plus symbol, to kind of show you some details of what we have in our change request form. So a short title on it, a description, priority, high, medium, low. Also what the change type is. Again, this can be configurable, but the sort of vanilla defaults are cost, scope, schedule, an estimated cost on this, a revised completion date. And again, that would typically be where you would leave it upon initial logging of a change request. Okay, you assign it to somebody, so that assignee might be the overall project sponsor, or might be a key stakeholder on the project. Okay, they will then typically come back in here and assign an approval date for the team, okay, and perhaps assign an approval date for the sponsor. And then there's a box in here where the team and sponsor can enter comments. And by the way, when comments get added here, okay, it will incrementally it will preserve the first comments that are added, and then the second commenter in there comes here and adds some more comments. So it will use the version control to keep track of the comments over time. So it's not as if, so if Victoria already loaded some comments in here and I edit this, I don't have any chance of, overwriting her comments. I can just simply append mine to hers. So you can keep track of them that way. Okay, so I'm going to cancel this form. I do already have a few change requests logged in my list here. Okay, so we have this pilot that's being requested before launch. Just quickly bring up the details on that. Okay, you can see that it has a status of pending PM review. So it's kind of, let's go through a workflow here. And let's say that, okay, we have reviewed this. Okay, the sponsor approves of this. Now, of course, that would entail adding some additional team comments, adding some additional sponsor comments. But, I'm going to, in the essence of saving time here with 23 minutes left, I'm going to go ahead and move this thing to an approval. Okay. And then for that scope change, again, in the spirit of, like full disclosure and full transparency on the project, okay, you could programmatically have that log a decision. Okay, but for demo purposes, I'm going to manually come over here to my decisions log. So I'm going to click the decisions link here. All right, and I'm going to log my new decision on this. Now in the decisions log, what you'll see, okay, of course, brief description of the decision, the description and overall impact, which can be a little lengthier, the source, whether it was a meeting, a person, whomever, again, an owner who's ultimately responsible for ensuring this decision is made, priority, status, etc. Okay, but down here on my decisions log, I also have the ability to link. So why was this decision made, or what is this decision needed for? Is it for a specific issue or issues, okay, that have been logged, okay, or was it in response to a change request? Okay, so I can have these related change requests. So, I can say that this particular decision, we're going to make it because this pilot request that wasn't originally in the planning for the schedule got approved. So this section right here, we can make sure that these related change requests only surface ones that have been approved. Don't just show me any change request that's been submitted to this point. But the approved ones, I can select that, log a decision that's made based upon this. Okay, and again, I'm going to hit cancel here. I do already have a couple decisions, okay, that have been logged for this particular AGH software development project. So this delay SFB integration and application, okay? I logged this decision. I did not specify the change request that basically spawned this decision or created the deed for this decision, but I'm going to go ahead and edit this item and add that in now. And then lastly, I'm going to show you how you can link any of these items, risks, action items, issues, change requests, or decisions, how you can link them to tasks in the schedule. Okay. So here, this pilot requested, I'm going to go ahead and add that in here. Save this. Okay. Now, seeing the impact of any of these artifacts on the schedule itself, so I still have this other project schedule open, but seeing the impact, as I look down through this, I mean, how do I tell whether any of these were the outcome of a decision or whether any of these were impacted by an issue that was raised on the project? Okay, there is an ability to link those items to tasks in the schedule. And this is, I wouldn't say it's a best kept secret, but it's a piece of functionality that not a lot of people know about within the tool here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate back to the landing page of this project site, give you a little description of what's going on here. Okay, so, again, imagine if you would, an issue that's been raised and even perhaps a decision that's been raised that is driving changes on tasks in a schedule or is going to impact one or more tasks in the schedule, and we want to link those two together. Okay. Now, you don't go to the specific log. Like in this case, I wouldn't go to an issue and then link it to a task, okay, or go to the decisions log and link it to a task. You go to the task itself, and then from there, you can tie the tasks in the schedule to any of these, list items up here. Okay. So on the project site itself, okay, I've got a link to the tasks list. Now, the tasks list that you see on the project site is a synchronized copy of the actual project schedule. Okay, so now this interface, again, it's a web interface. This is not as robust as Project Professional, but if I had this project opened up in Project Professional, I would be seeing the exact same items here. Okay, now down at the project site, okay, you're kind of limited to what you can do to this task. It even says here, the project can only be edited through Project Web App. Okay, so in other words, I can't use this to mark task complete or to change the due date on them or anything like that. But I can use this to link an associated risk, issue, action item, change request, or decision to an item in this. Okay, so let me, here, I'm going to come down here, this review modular code. Okay, so, if you would, try to keep this in the back of your mind, review modular code. I'm going to link, in this case, I'll take an issue, okay? So there's an issue that's been logged, but again, it could be a risk, could be an action item, could be a change request or a decision, and I'm going to associate it with this item. So I'm going to click on review modular code, okay? And then there's this little show more, okay, which exposes a few more columns or a few more fields on this one particular item from the schedule. So I can see here there's no related items on this. I can see what the predecessors are. I can see some other details, percent complete, who it's assigned to, what the projected start and finish dates are. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a related item. Hit this hyperlink here. And this allows me to navigate into, so again, I've mentioned this is for about the 4th time now. I could add a risk, an issue, an action item, a change request, or a decision as a linked item here. Okay, and the way that that works is it lets me navigate into any of those lists here from the interface. So as I said, stay true to my word here. I'm going to open up an issue, and I'm going to pick an issue that was logged that is going to potentially have an impact on this test task here. So automated software testing tool fail, that definitely, this issue that's been logged could have a severe impact on this task in the schedule. So I'm going to relate it. I'm going to link it to the task in the schedule. So I select it, hit the insert button. Okay, it shows it as a related item to this modular code review here. So I'm going to close that out. All right. And now, me as a PM looking at the schedule, again, I mean, the task list here is okay for certain things, but it's not what I'm going to use, typically speaking, to really manage the schedule, or program manager, or portfolio owner looking at some details that have bubbled up from the schedule. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go back up to the detail level of this project, navigate away from the project site here, and I'm going to go to the oops, I accidentally did a second click there, so that was unintentional. I'm going to navigate back down to the details of that AGH software development project again. Okay, and then navigate to the schedule, which is what I had intended to do all along. Okay, now a couple things. This is visible in both the web version of the schedule and if I open this in Project Pro. And by this, what I'm referring to is when you link risks, issues, etc., to tasks in the schedule. Okay, so here's my review modular code task in the schedule. Okay, it picks up an icon in this indicators column here that lets me know that this is specifically the icon for an issue. Okay, I have a separate icon up here that lets me know that in this case there's a risk associated with this task. So when you link those types of items to tasks in the schedule, you get some visibility on that. Same thing would happen, so if I pulled the task and I said open this in Microsoft Project, I would see the exact same graphical indicators beside these tasks in Project Professional as well. Okay, and also in both cases, I can simply click on the icon for that, and it's going to take me specifically. So as I'm looking at this review modular code task in the schedule, I can bounce directly over to the issue that's impacting potentially the delivery date of this review modular code task by clicking on the icon in the indicators column here. So it takes me, not only does it take me to the issues list, it takes me specifically to that particular task and the issue that's linked to it for this particular project. So, again, I can click on this. Okay, and again, if I need to take action on this, on the associated issue here, okay, I can simply hit edit, say, okay, it's active. We're going to, increase the priority of this to high. It's close to coming to fruition. Add some items to the discussion. Hopefully, start working on resolution. Okay, but I've got visibility into that, and I can track that by using these, these pieces of functionality that we have here down on the project site. Now, the last best practice that I'm going to, leave you with, we've got 15 minutes left, actually just under 15 minutes left here. I want to leave some time open for Q&A at the end. Okay, so by utilizing, all the features that we have on a project site, to manage things that may have an impact on overall scope, okay, by following some of the best practices with schedule management, okay, to address, scope changes and to handle scope changes and how they impact costs, delivery dates, things like that. Okay, we've talked about that already. But, one element that's often overlooked, specifically if you're using Microsoft Project Online or Project Server as your tool for project and portfolio management, is as you have projects that have had scope changes introduced to them, and those scope changes, have had impacts on the projects overall, it's certainly going to impact potentially the budget. It's also going to potentially impact your resource availability. So that new deliverable that I added to the schedule in the first demo, who's actually going to work on that? I mean, I assigned it to a generic developer task, but as we get closer to that, that April start date, I need to pick specific people from the resource pool, okay, to work on that, and I need to see what impacts they might have. Okay, so what I'm alluding to here is we've got a feature in the Microsoft PPM tool in Project Online called Portfolio Analysis. Okay, and what people often overlook is, they'll use portfolio analysis periodically. They'll measure, usually they'll measure things like proposals against their in-flight projects. Figure out, hey, can we do these proposals? Are they going to have an adverse impact on our portfolio budget? Are they going to have an adverse impact on our available resources? Okay, but oftentimes what they won't do is reanalyze in-flight projects, particularly those that have had scope changes, to see if there are any new impacts. Okay, so now, if I kind of, again, circle back to the first demo that I gave here. So imagine that project, which was that B0001 SAP integration. It's had the scope change work items introduced into the schedule. The schedule's been published. So if I want to reevaluate that project along with my other in-flight projects, okay, what I might want to do is set up a new portfolio analysis here to see, hey, how is that impacting my available resources? How is it impacting the budget overall? Okay, so real quickly now, to do a full portfolio analysis, even in demo purposes, takes, generally speaking, about 15 minutes. So I'm going to kind of fly through this pretty quickly. I'm just going to call this demo. Okay, I'm going to select the projects that I want to be included in this analysis. So I have a specific view set up, okay, where I can select, just my in-flight projects, okay, and compare them against each other. Okay, so there's all of my selection candidates. I'm going to add them to the list of selected projects. That's 22 of them. I'm going to pick my budget field here, okay, and I'm also going to analyze the resource constraints. So that, one of that projects among the mix was the project where I made a modification to the schedule. Okay, so looking at the, the planning horizon for these project schedules, tell me what the impacts look like. Okay, so I'm going to select all the other necessary items here to do my portfolio analysis. Now, the focus of this webinar is not on performing portfolio analysis. It's one of the tools you can use to manage, overall within the portfolio. So I'm not really wearing my PM hat any longer. I've switched my hats to more of a portfolio owner, okay, or perhaps a program manager who's analyzing impacts across multiple projects, not just analyzing the impacts of, perhaps 4 or 5 projects that they themselves manage. Okay, so when I utilize this, okay, now the first couple screens here deal primarily with prioritization. Now, those changes may impact prioritization overall, but typically it's not going to impact prioritization overall. But what I want to use this analysis tool for is to take a look at a cost analysis and a resource analysis. So again, as much as I can in about the next 4 minutes to leave a few minutes left for Q&A at the end, I can see, what impact the project that's had any changes, what impact it has on the budget, okay? And more importantly, I can see if I go over to the Analyze Resources, and also, very likely, obviously, if you're adding new details to the schedule, okay, to address, a change in scope where you have new work that's being done, that's certainly going to have an impact on the, your resource pool. So you're either, using new resources for that, or you're taking existing resources and, putting more work on their plate, or putting work, down at the end of their plate. But when you come over to the Analyze Resources here, this can give you some in-depth analysis of which projects might be impacted. So what you have here, you've got this selected bucket at the top, which shows you the projects that have no resource constraint issues. And you've got the not selected projects, okay, which means that these ones, you can continue to do them, but these are representing projects that have constraint issues. Okay? And again, very quickly, in a nutshell, what I can do here is I can, utilizing the Gantt here, I can move some of these around. Okay, so that, that scope change may have thrown that project out of the mix. Well, what if I, defer some of these other projects here, temporarily, or, put them on hold, move them down a little bit, so I don't have all of this overlap of projects going on here. So there's a lot of what-if analysis you can do to this. Okay, I can, apply new starts to some of these projects. Now, if it's an in-flight project, I can't apply a new start to it because it's already in flight. Okay, what you can do, what can I do with these in-flight projects that might get them to move from this, unfavorable selection bucket to the more favorable selection bucket? The other what-if analysis you can do on this is you can add, you can certainly throw more money at this. So if I had in my budget, let's say an additional 40 grand, 50 grand, 100 grand, 4 million, whatever. You can plug those numbers in and see what kind of impact that has on your portfolio of projects. So that'll help shift, the projects around. What you're ultimately doing here is you're trying to get the optimum selection of projects, and have the tool tell you that the projects that you are in fact doing. So if these represent your in-flight projects, okay, the ones that you are in fact doing are not representing any resource constraint issues. Now that was, kind of a fast 30,000-foot flyover of portfolio analysis, but, hopefully from, those 3 areas, so, baselining best practices within the schedule, using the project site to their best effect, and then also when you have scope changes on a project, particularly if you're using Microsoft Project Online or Project Server, reanalyzing the portfolio of projects using the portfolio analysis tool, those can, hopefully help you, get your house in order with regards to managing scope. So with 5 minutes left, I'll open the floor up. I don't know, Victoria, if there were any questions typed in.
I mean, I don't know about you, but I actually do.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
So I had a question come up. So how much does the software cost and maintenance cost?
So Project Online is a user subscription license based. So there's 3 different tiers, and Project Online or Project Server, that's the platform itself, which Quick PMO bolts on top of. So with Project Online, you pay a per month subscription, for each user, depending upon their level of access. So the bottom tier is what's called Project Essentials, and that's generally for your team members. Base price of that is $7 a month. Of course, if you have like an enterprise agreement, you can get a better deal. Next level up would be your PM subscription license, which is $33 a month. And then the top level, which is for portfolio managers, portfolio owners, stuff like that, a smaller population within your organization, that's $53 a month. So those would be the per user per month costs for those different roles. Quick PMO on top of that, what you saw me going through today was the Quick PMO Pro functionality, and frankly, you saw about 1% of its overall functionality, but that is the bolt-on that I was using. That's a fixed $50,000 cost. We also have Quick PMO Lite, which has a little bit lesser functionality if you're sort of lower on the maturity curve in your PMO, but you still need kind of a turnkey solution accelerator to get you started in the tool. Quick PMO Lite is half that cost. And again, on our website, so I'll just kind of bring that up, vibrantfusion.com. If you navigate to our solutions page, we have a description here of the differences between Quick PMO Pro, Quick PMO Lite. On the Learn More page, kind of going a little fast here, but you can scroll to the bottom, and there's a feature list that shows you a comparison between what we have available in Quick PMO Lite and Quick PMO Pro. So sorry, that was kind of a lengthy answer, but I wanted to be thorough on that. Any other questions from anyone? Well, I'll hang on for another couple minutes. I want to thank everybody that attended. If you do have a question, by all means, enter it in the chat window, or you can speak it in the in your headset phone, however you're connected to the audio portion of this meeting.
I had an additional question here.
Yeah.
Is training required?
If you want to increase adoption, absolutely. And with Quick PMO, training is part of every engagement that we do. It's included in the fixed cost price. From a best practices standpoint, from a reality standpoint, I would have to say yes, training is required with this. If you don't adequately train your users, you're not going to have them following best practices. You're not going to have them following, the governance that you've laid out in this. And adoption will certainly suffer because of that. So I would, strongly recommend that yes, your project managers, your administrators, and your team members, select training for this.
Great, thank you, Aaron. Sorry, I just have a couple more if you have the time.
Sure, yeah, fire away.
Okay, so what are some best practices we can follow with the Microsoft project schedule to address scope creep?
Well, I would say, the single biggest one I would say was make sure the original demo that I did here, make sure that you are, baselining your project, at least initially when you have your plan, hopefully more or less fleshed out, but before progress is started on the project. And, secondarily, if there have been significant changes and you need to incorporate those, try to follow that process that I followed with doing multiple baselines of the project. That's probably the single biggest one out there.
Okay. And what's the best way to capture discussions and decisions that ultimately might result in change of scope?
Okay. Some of them I showed you when we were down at the project site for that particular project. So here, let me navigate back to one of those project sites. Some of those, I did, again, I only have an hour, so some of those you didn't see. By all means, utilizing the risks, action items, issues, change request, decisions logs that we have on the project site, that's going to be the best place to capture those types of artifacts. If it's a little bit more free-flowing, discussion type things, or you're tracking, meeting minutes and some of the discussion during those, weekly staff meetings, that you capture in minutes, that might be better served by using another feature that we have is the project notebook that's incorporated with each project. So that utilizes Microsoft OneNote, which you can edit through the browser, or if you have the OneNote client installed, you can edit the OneNote details through that. So in this case, you'll see what I have in my OneNote is I have one section set up for meeting minutes, and I've captured my weekly meeting minutes on different pages in here. I also have a different section on here for team member notes. So OneNote is a tremendous tool and a tremendous platform for kind of capturing, a digital notebook, if you would. So, things that might be a little bit more fluid in nature, not quite as structured as logging a risk or logging an issue. So, I would definitely recommend utilizing this as well as those other lists that I pointed out earlier in the demo.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions I have. So that'll do it. Thank you all for joining us on this PMO webcast. Please feel free to connect with us on our social media to stay tuned for our next webcast. Our next webcast will be on April 26th at the same time, and we'll be focusing on planning your user adoption rollout. So again, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Aaron, for presenting. I look forward to seeing you all in our next webcast.
My pleasure. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.